In 2018, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine released a report entitled Public Health Consequences of E-Cigarettes. This report provided a much-needed investigation into the use of e-cigarettes and the potential effects on public health in a number of domains. This report was necessary because the current research and regulatory landscape of e-cigarettes is not sufficient to address the many concerns their use has raised. E-cigarettes have significantly grown in popularity since their introduction to the U.S. market in 2007. This is particularly true among adolescents. Further, the technology of the product itself has undergone significant growth. E-cigarettes now come in a huge variety of models that provide different functionality to the user and result in different health effects. They may also be known as vaporizers, vape pens, and e-hookahs. The regulatory environment has not kept up with this growth in popularity or technology, resulting in many untested products on the market with little oversight. Further, the research in many domains has been conflicting or insufficient. This has resulted in the public receiving a mixed message from experts regarding the safety and public health impact of e-cigarettes. The National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine report summarized and synthesized the current available evidence on e-cigarettes in a number of domains. They present their conclusions based on the level of evidence available for each domain. This ranges from no evidence to conclusive evidence, as shown here. As the evidence progresses towards conclusive, there is great confidence that the conclusions are valid and that the limitations can be ruled out. The level of evidence is based on the quantity and quality of studies available. Regarding addictive potential, conclusion 4.1 from the report states that there is conclusive evidence that exposure to nicotine from e-cigarettes is highly variable and depends on product characteristics, including device characteristics and e-liquid characteristics, and how the device is operated. This means that any given combination of e-cigarette, e-cigarette settings, and e-liquid can produce widely varying amounts of nicotine. Conclusion 4.2 states that there is substantial evidence that nicotine intake from e-cigarette devices among experienced adult e-cigarette users can be comparable to that from combustible tobacco cigarettes. So those who are knowledgeable about e-cigarettes may configure theirs to provide just as much nicotine as combustible cigarettes would. Conclusion 8.1 states that there is substantial evidence that e-cigarette use results in symptoms of dependence on e-cigarettes. So it is likely that e-cigarette users do develop dependence on e-cigarettes. Finally, conclusion 8.2 states that there is moderate evidence that the risk and severity of dependence are lower for e-cigarettes than combustible tobacco cigarettes. So the dependence on e-cigarettes is likely less than the typical dependence on combustible cigarettes. Regarding constituents of e-cigarettes, conclusion 5.1 from the report states that there is conclusive evidence that in addition to nicotine, most e-cigarette products contain and emit numerous potentially toxic substances. E-cigarettes do produce some toxins in addition to nicotine. Conclusion 5.2 states that there is conclusive evidence that other than nicotine, the number, quantity, and characteristics of potentially toxic substances emitted from e-cigarettes is highly variable and depends again on product characteristics, including device and e-liquid characteristics, and how the device is operated. So the amount of these toxins are dependent on the type of e-cigarette, the type of e-liquid, and the settings chosen for the e-cigarette. Finally, conclusion 5.3 states that there is substantial evidence that, except for nicotine, under typical conditions of use, exposure to potentially toxic substances from e-cigarettes is significantly lower compared with combustible tobacco cigarettes. In other words, exposure to these toxins among users is lower than exposure for combustible cigarette users. To investigate the potential gateway effects of e-cigarettes, the authors conceptualized this model. Baseline smoking is defined as either combustible cigarette use only or dual use, where both combustible cigarettes and e-cigarettes are used. Baseline non-smoking is defined as use of only e-cigarettes or use of neither product. From this non-smoking status, one could progress to an intermediate state of smoking. This could either be a transient experimental phase or result in becoming a consistent smoker. The relevant path for gateway effects is that from the e-cigarette only user to in-smoking status. Conclusion 16.1 states that there is substantial evidence that e-cigarette use increases risk of ever using combustible tobacco cigarettes among youth and young adults. So based on this model, it is likely that use of e-cigarettes increases the risk of subsequent combustible cigarette use. Further, conclusion 16.2 states that among youth and young adult e-cigarette users who ever use combustible tobacco cigarettes, there is moderate evidence that e-cigarette use increases the frequency and intensity of subsequent combustible tobacco cigarette smoking. Conclusion 16.3 states that among youth and young adult e-cigarette users who ever use combustible tobacco cigarettes, there is limited evidence that e-cigarette use increases in the near term the duration of subsequent combustible tobacco cigarette smoking. In order to explore potential alternatives, the authors investigated the temporality of the progression, as in whether e-cigarette precedes cigarette use or vice versa, the dose-response effect, as in whether more e-cigarette use was associated with more subsequent combustible cigarette use, and the plausibility of e-cigarettes serving as a gateway to combustible cigarettes. To investigate the potential cessation utility of e-cigarettes, the authors conceptualized this model. Again, smoking is defined as combustible cigarette use only or dual use, while non-smoking is defined as e-cigarette use only or no use of either product. This model also allows for a potentially transient intermediate state. Based on this, conclusion 17.1 states that overall there is limited evidence that e-cigarettes may be effective aids to promote smoking cessation. This is due to conflicting evidence and a lack of substantial body of evidence. Further, conclusion 17.3 states that there is insufficient evidence from randomized controlled trials about the effectiveness of e-cigarettes as cessation aids compared with no treatment or to FDA-approved smoking cessation treatments. Very few studies have been conducted, and they are lower quality studies, meaning we cannot say e-cigarettes are comparable to FDA-approved cessation options. Conclusion 17.2 states that there is moderate evidence from randomized control trials that e-cigarettes with nicotine are more effective than e-cigarettes without nicotine for smoking cessation. So if e-cigarettes prove effective for quitting, it is likely that e-cigarettes with nicotine will be more effective than those without nicotine. However, conclusion 17.4 states that while the overall evidence from observational trials is mixed, there is moderate evidence from observational studies that more frequent use of e-cigarettes is associated with increased likelihood of cessation. So at the population level, e-cigarette use is associated with successful cessation from combustible cigarettes. This could be due to many factors. Regarding harm reduction, conclusion 18.1 from the report states that there is conclusive evidence that completely substituting e-cigarettes for combustible tobacco cigarettes reduces users' exposure to numerous toxicants and carcinogens present in combustible tobacco cigarettes. Further, conclusion 18.2 states that there is substantial evidence that completely switching from regular use of combustible tobacco cigarettes to e-cigarettes results in reduced short-term adverse health outcomes in several organ systems. So taken together, this means that e-cigarette only use appears to be substantially less harmful than combustible cigarette only use. However, this is only shown if the user completely stops use of combustible cigarettes, as shown by conclusion 18.3, which states that there is no available evidence whether or not long-term e-cigarette use among smokers, considered dual use, changes morbidity or mortality compared with those who only smoke combustible tobacco cigarettes. Further, conclusion 18.4 states that there is insufficient evidence that e-cigarette use changes short-term adverse health outcomes in several organ systems in smokers who continue to smoke combustible tobacco cigarettes, also considered dual users. So despite e-cigarettes being on the US market for over a decade, there is still much research to do. Short-term and especially long-term health effects need elucidated. Further research needs to be done to determine e-cigarettes' utility as a cessation device, including e-cigarettes' attractiveness and availability as a cessation device compared to other methods, as well as the concerns for potential dual use. The net public health impact also remains unknown. This lack of evidence can leave healthcare providers in a position without solid advice to give to their patients.